Thank you everyone for coming here and welcome everyone online as well. I am Rocky Jishi, a PhD student at Low China Institute. I'm the moderator of today's discussion on inequality and exclusion in contemporary China education system. If later anyone could not hear us clearly, please raise your hands up. We want to be as inclusive as we can in this discussion at least. So in China, the university entrance exam is called Gaokao. The score is from the exam is a sole deciding factor for admittance into universities in China. The Gaokao is the fairest selection process in your whole life. This is a sentence I heard a lot during my secondary education. In China, teachers, families, and society use the meritocratic nature of Gaokao and the rhetoric of effort leads to reward to encourage students to study hard. However, this ideal does not apply to all in Chinese education system. Even after tremendous improvement in access to all levels of schooling in China during the past 3 decades, there are still rural students who find it difficult to receive education as good as their urban counterparts, those who migrate with their parents, needing piles of documents to compete for the limited access to urban public school, those who grow up in areas with less college quota and are therefore discouraged with thoughts like it's never my turn, despite being qualified. So, when describing Chinese education system as a meritocracy, does it belong to a certain group? Who is being excluded and how are they excluded? What is the long-term impact of the inequality and exclusion to the education access in contemporary China? Today, we are honored to have a group of experts who have done research on different aspects of inequality and exclusion in education system in contemporary China to talk about these questions. Please let me introduce our panelists here. First of all, Professor Emily Hannum, who joined us online. Dr. Emily Hannum is Professor of Sociology and Education at the University of Pennsylvania. Her research interests are poverty and child welfare, gender and ethnic stratification, and the sociology of education. Then Dr. Charlotte Gutmann. Charlotte is reader in Chinese politics and development. Charlotte's research and teaching engages with the politics and institutions of internal migration in China in comparative perspective, most notably with India. Ye Liu, who sits at the end of there, is reader in international development. Ye's research focuses on systems of inequality, how cultural and policy reproduce education and gender inequalities in contemporary China. Finally is Dr. Xia Yang. She is postdoctoral research associate in Chinese migration at Low China Institute. Before coming to King's, she got her PhD in geography from the University of Washington. So welcome all of you. Let's start our discussion here now. Hi, Emily. I would like to start with you first. You have worked on rural education and rural-urban education disparity in China since 1990s. So could you please provide us an overview of how had the education agenda historically fluctuated in relation to the rural-urban relations after 1949? And what has been the situation for rural students' education in rural communities in recent decades?
Oh, thanks very much. I really appreciate the chance to be part of this panel and happy to engage with these questions. I think in terms of the my sort of background and perspective on some of this, my background is in sociology and social demography, and I think we tend to be interested in both what's going on inside the educational system, but also to put a kind of high weight on issues that might be disequalizing that are happening outside of the educational system. So that's just a bit of context for what I will say here. In terms of the sort of longer term fluctuations, I think China was really lauded as being a country that's succeeded in really expanding the base of education, meaning expanding education into rural areas. A lot of that happening in the kind of era predating market reforms. And of course, there was a lot of sort of debate about content of schooling and concerns about, rapid expansion and quality of schooling. But I think there's really, a lot of feeling that expansion of the base of schooling to masses of people was really, really important for understanding some of the of setting the stage for kind of very rapid economic development that happened later as China succeeded in doing that while there's sort of an expansion of the base of the population structure. I then was able to enjoy kind of a dividend of people with of sort of much more educated population reaching into the working ages. And of course, that's turning around a bit now. If talking about, so I do think that there were, there were kind of stark changes in the priority attached to rural education over time. And of course, now we're kind of in a very different time than the sort of time period in which a philosophy of kind of really revolutionary expansion was happening. I think that I wanted to talk about maybe three things that I think are, well, maybe four things that are, I think, really important in thinking about what's happening in recent years that is related to rural access and rural inequality in education. One is the kind of poverty context. And as I know people are really well aware, recent decades have been a time of very dramatic changes that have kind of altered the context in which children are educated across China. And I think that's had some really interesting implications for rural children's access. And I think this has to do with, first, I think China's rapid growth and rapid poverty alleviation, which had one impact of generating resources that enabled a kind of real push toward addressing some of the obstacles to access facing rural China. So I think that the prosperity that happened afforded resources to launch some pretty dramatic poverty alleviation strategies. I know that there's a lot of debate about what is the most appropriate measure of poverty and how to think about the scale of poverty reduction, but I think there's a general agreement that there was a whole lot of success in poverty alleviation over the past 40 years in China. Of course, there is a situation. Of course, many households continue to face issues of poverty, and I would say up in the years just before the pandemic started, the eradication of absolute poverty became a kind of very explicit policy goal at the national level. I think that some of that, why I'm talking about that has to do with sort of the circumstances of absolute deprivation that families are living in, and some of it has to do with a lot of investments, particularly in Western China, in transportation and communication infrastructures that mean that children, families, and school personnel are increasingly connected to kind of the broader country outside their own communities. So that is I think one positive story that needs to be acknowledged. I think some other things have happened that are, that are mixed and also very important for thinking about opportunity for education in rural areas. Of course, another huge transformation in Chinese society has been urbanization, which has already come up in the introductory remarks, I think. With a lot of economic inequality between urban and rural areas and some weakening of historical barriers to migration, we know that the kind of emptying out of rural villages to urban locations has started to happen has been happening on a very large scale. This has kind of really, I think, some very challenging implications for rural children more broadly, but also, thinking about rural children's education in the context of kind of what what might be considered kind of hollowing out of the middle generation in some places, is that, we have a situation where populations are sort of dropping in rural villages, both at the parent level and also populations of children. This is creating a kind of some real opportunity. Obviously, migration is often about seeking economic opportunity, but this is, I think, this sort of movement away from agriculture has thought by some to kind of be eroding a longstanding social safety net in rural areas.
Okay, thank you, Emily. Let's stop here now. I think
okay.
I will continue to ask you the following things about the urbanization, because we mentioned urbanization here. Now, I will come to you, Charlotte. Could you please share us more about, because I know you are working on the migrant children who migrate with their parents. I think this is also part of the process of urbanization. So can you provide more insight into the situation of migrant children? What challenges do they face when they try to get access to public schools?
So the population of migrant children is a very large one. Person say the size of the population. The most recent statistics are from 2023 from the National Bureau of Statistics together with the UN Children's Fund. And they estimate that the number of children of migrant workers in China is 138 million. That's about 47% of the population of children in China. And out of those, 71 million are thought to be migrant children, i.e. those that have migrated with their parents away from their original place of residence. 67 million are thought to be left behind children who remain in their place of origin without their parents, one of those parents. I perhaps should start with a quick overview of the entitlements to education that migrant children have had historically in China before coming on to what I think has changed in the present day. So despite the fact that local governments were required by law to provide 9 years of education, now I have microphone. I can speak more quietly. Despite the fact that the local governments in China were required to provide 9 years of education by law, until 1996, migrant children were refused permission to enroll in city-state schools altogether. In that year, in 1996, legislation changed that. New regulations allowed those without a local urban hukou, household registration, they allowed them to enroll in city-state schools. But even after they were officially allowed entry, it was very difficult for most migrant children to get into those state schools at that point because of very high fee barriers, a whole range of legal and extra-legal fees that were targeted specifically at migrant children. Now, in 2008, all tuition fees for the compulsory 9 years of education were abolished nationwide, rural and urban, by 2008. So migrant children then became eligible to receive 9 years of compulsory free education wherever they were. However, and this is a very big however, many city governments lack the incentives and sometimes the financial resources to actually accommodate those migrant children. The center has encouraged, urged, exhorted local governments to provide that state school education for migrant children. But in reality, we haven't seen that. And instead, what I think we have seen in the shift since 2008, tuition fee abolition, is a move away from the mechanism of migrant exclusion from education being about the central Chinese government and about the hukou system of household registration to being a decentralized system of exclusion operated by local urban governments through a whole piecemeal set of different documentary barriers that they have erected. The local governments, of course, it needs to be said, are the ones who pay most of the costs for providing these services, including education. So despite only collecting around 50% of the revenues, local governments foot the bill for around 80% or 80 to 85% of public services, including that education. And, you know, the increasingly precarious nature in China of local government finances casts a lot of doubt on the willingness of most localities to expand that social expenditure. Plus, of course, the fact that local cadres, local officials are evaluated on how well they provide for the locally registered population, not the migrant one. So my recent project, British Academy funded project on documents and registration regimes, examined the kinds of barriers that urban governments have erected in response to the abolition of tuition fees. I did a lot of this research in Shenzhen, which is known as a relatively welcoming city for migrants. And I found that even there, even in Shenzhen, to get into the compulsory education period of primary school or junior middle school, you would require, as a non-local hukou person, 6 official documents, including your residence permit, your proof of employment, your local residence and social insurance payment, your family planning certificate, and a letter of school transfer from your originally registered school that you've come from. Shenzhen is by no means unusual, I should say. Many other megacities have very similar requirements. If you look at Beijing, I looked at the documents needed to get into a school in Beijing since 2017. Not only do you need those documents themselves that are required for school entry, even to get those documents, you need other documents. So I'm calling these gateway documents and the prior documents. Now, the prior documents, if you wanted to get a residence permit in Beijing to get into school, before you can get the residence permit, you need the work permit, you need the proof of income, you need the continuous residence certificate. To get the proof of residence certificate, you need the rental contract for wherever you're living. You need the certificate of property ownership. You need the identity card of the property owner, who's obviously got to agree to that. You need proof of 6 months tax payments, and you need a whole load of other documents. In total, 20 to 30 pieces of paper, pieces of card, nice shiny bits of plastic might be required. The housing documents are particularly difficult for the migrants to get. A lot of them are in informal private rentals. They're not officially let, that the landlord is definitely not going to hand over their documents and say, yes, go and take this to some organ of the state to make it official that I'm letting my place to you. Something that's really worth pointing out here, I think, is that elite migrants are, of course, much more likely to be able to access all of these documents. So what these kinds of educational barriers do is tend to restrict education provision to the children of migrants whom the urban governments would like to attract. That is, the wealthier, the more educated migrants, often those who have come from another city, and they tend to exclude poorer, lower skilled, rural migrants. And in that sense, I would suggest the restriction of educational access is a form of migration control for the cities that very closely resembles transnational migration. One more point, Rocky, I'm running out of time, I'm well aware. So what do the children do when they can't get into the schools? They turn to private educational provision, often low quality private schools, often unlicensed private schools, often closed down by the local authorities. I've worked in a number of these over the last decade in China, in Beijing, in Shenzhen, and Shanghai. None of the ones in which I have taught or observed classes are still there. They have been shut down on the grounds of low quality, or they didn't meet the requirements, and the children have not been provided with any alternative education source. This is still a very major problem. There's a lot more I could say about this. As Rocky said, I've done a lot of comparative work with India, including some quite surprising findings. We could talk more in the Q&A. There's a gender element that I think is often overlooked. Girls are less likely to have the certificates in the first place, less likely to get into school. And as Emily highlighted, you know, there's a huge issue of left behind children, the ones who didn't migrate to the cities, who are struggling to access a decent education in the context of absent parents and grandparent caregivers and sometimes quite remote schools. But I've run out of time. We'll leave that there for the moment.
Thank you for your consideration, Charlotte. So as you offered us so many details about how the migrant children found it's difficult to get access to urban schools, Xia, following Charlotte's observation, could you provide us more information on how local governments in the destinations shape the education rights of migrant children, either in alignment with or in opposition to the central policy?
I think Charlotte has covered most of the things that I want to say, but anyhow, I think I add a bit more details to what she has already covered. So most of the time, local governments, they play the role of agents for central policy implementation. So they basically just carry out education policies set down by the central government. In this regard, I think there are two important policies worth mentioning. So in 2001, the central government announced the two means policy. In Chinese, it's called 两为主, which means that migrant children should receive education mainly in public schools and mainly in the destinations. Another policy is in 2003. So the central government required that local governments of the destinations subsidize schools that accept a big number of migrant children. So if we just take these two policies together, we can conclude that it's a responsibility of the destination local governments to educate and to pay for the education of migrant children. And the central government requires them to do so, as pointed by Charlotte, without giving much essential financial help. And on the other hand, the central government leaves it to local governments to decide who are eligible, quote unquote, to receive education. And under this mechanism, local governments have much discretion concerning the documentary requirements for migrants to receive education. And Charlotte has done some very interesting research on this. The documentary requirements largely revolve around the local hukou system. That is the criteria migrants need to meet in order to gain access to local public services, similar or at least close to those received by local hukou holders. Besides the local hukou system, there's also the 学籍 system, which is a student identification system. Initially, the 学籍 system was established by the central government to facilitate students' registration and transfer between different schools. However, in practice, it was used as an additional tool by local governments to decide whom they want to offer education to. To transfer migrant children's 学籍 from their origins to the destinations, their parents need to provide even more additional documents. So in short, local governments make use of the hukou system and the 学籍 system, which were initially designed by the central government to select a small group of migrant population, as Charlotte mentioned, the wealthy, the talents, and the elites, and provide education to them while they exclude a lot of them.
Okay. Oh, thank you, Shasha. Well, time control. Okay, for now, we have learned a lot about the elementary education for a while. Now let's come to Ye, who are working on the specifically Gaokao selection system and higher education. Ye, could you please share us with what the inequality in education looks like during the Gaokao selection stage, and how does the gender factor influence the inequality and exclusion in higher education?
I don't think I can finish in 5 minutes.
No.
I will focus on the first part of the
No,
question.
yeah.
So just following up what Emily mentioned about this kind of expansion of education opportunity during China's Great Transformation, I want to talk about just a kind of echo what Rocky said in an opening remark about what, the merit, this kind of association of a meritocratic nature of the Gaokao. So any of you who attended the Gaokao, please raise your hand. Okay, so we have a few Gaokao taker, excellent, so you can really contribute to the discussion. So first of all, Gaokao, we need to, when we talk about inequalities, we need to kind of step back, talk about the origin of Gaokao. Gaokao was reintroduced in 1977 as, after the Cultural Revolution. So Gaokao is not just an exam system, it actually marked the Chinese transition from a political chaos into a modern society, into a market economy. So that, the Gaokao is not just a Gaokao, it's about how Gaokao transformed, individual citizen psyche in terms of embracing this concept of, social selection based on individual merit, rather than your CCP affiliation, rather than political selection. When I did my fieldwork in 2005, the original fieldwork 2005, followed up in 2016, I did a survey study in Anhui and Zhejiang in 2005, 2006, 2007. And my sample did show Gaokao results was very meritocratic at that time. But when we look at the bigger picture at the national level, so around 2006, Gaokao takers only around 15% of secondary school leavers actually attended university. So still Gaokao was still highly selective. And if we look at the kind of a relationship between individuals' socio-economic backgrounds and the Gaokao result, the survey I did found a very weak kind of correlation. But my survey was not perfect, I would say. I did not, in my survey data, we didn't have enough kind of rural students, like where Emily, highlighted all these poor children didn't have sufficient education opportunity at the compulsory education stage. So, so there was it's difficult to say, to judge Gaokao as a perfect meritocratic kind of selection. But apart from the quantitative data, when I interview people, and people told me Gaokao is the only fair system in China when I did my fieldwork in 2005 to 2007. So, and during the COVID, I thought, it's time for me to follow up with this, original respondent to see whether they still think Gaokao is meritocratic. Because nationwide, there's a huge kind of public debate. So we can see the kind of attitudinal change about Gaokao. So at the beginning, Gaokao was 千军万马过独木桥, those kind of highly competitive exam, very fair system, redistributing opportunities across, different social groups. And then we had this Gaokao champion, Gaokao 状元 from Beijing, and he was interviewed after he scored the highest the national Gaokao exam in Beijing. And he said, Gaokao used to be poor kids' dream, but now it's all about us. It's all about social capital. It's all about cultural capital. And that really kind of started a whole debate about whether Gaokao is still meritocratic. And it's still really kind of contested topic in China. So I follow up with my original respondent who were now in their mid-30s. So I categorize them as a Gaokao champion, Gaokao loser, and a Gaokao mediocre. By their own count, not by me. So in original interview, they said, I'm Gaokao loser because I didn't get my first choice. I'm here because I was not selected. I was not good enough. And Gaokao mediocre meant those scores just matched this kind of a second-tier university. And Gaokao champion was a girl whose parents were vegetable farmers in Anhui, and she managed to get to Beida, Peking University, one of the most prestigious universities in China. So when I tracked their life course transition, and I found the Gaokao champion is now a sales businesswoman in Shanghai, who is still on a very precarious working condition, even with a Peking University degree. And I found this Gaokao mediocre, who managed to get to Zhejiang University because of his parents' information strategy and kind of a borderline bribery at the time of the Gaokao application. And he's now a startup millionaire. And when we had an interview, he had a fancy flat in Hangzhou overlooking Xihu. And when we had this kind of Gaokao loser who did not get to the first place in the Gaokao, is now a university lecturer in Anhui. So when I asked him about to what extent Gaokao changed your destiny in Chinese term, Gaokao 改变命运. So they kind of rephrase 知识改变命运 at the time when the knowledge economy really kicked off. And to what extent Gaokao 改变命运 change your destiny? And for the Gaokao mediocre, who is now a university lecturer, she said, for her, it was a upward social mobility because her parents were working class in a small city in Anhui. And for this startup millionaire, And he said, Gaokao was nothing. Gaokao didn't change anything. I didn't learn anything in university. It's all my parents' money who helped me to get into business school in Australia and helped me build these networks. So, and then when I asked the Gaokao champion, who was on full scholarship at Peking University, didn't get, because of lack of social guanxi network, and she couldn't get into elite graduate school, and she didn't have a scholarship to study abroad, so she ended up doing kind of a private businesses since her graduation. For her, she also said, Gaokao is kind of a, Gaokao changed my life, because otherwise I would be selling vegetables with my parents in Anhui. So now at least I can make ends meet. I'm a professional woman, so from her perspective, Gaokao did change her destiny. But Gaokao is such a fantastic topic. It's very difficult to just summarize in 3 minutes. But I hope to give a flavor of what Gaokao is, how people view Gaokao in China.
Okay, thank you, Ye. It's fascinating to hear this various trajectory of individual person and how Gaokao have an influence on their own life. Let's just following up the issues in higher education with you. Like 2 months ago, when it's time for senior high school students filling in college application form, a virtual university called Shanhe Daxue was created by online users. The creation and discussion around this term revealed significant regional higher education inequality in 4 North Chinese provinces, Shandong, Shanxi, Henan, and Hebei. Could you talk more about the geographical inequality in higher education resource allocation and the students' access to it based on this? Thank you.
Thank you. So Shanhe Daxue is a kind of a virtual university. It's almost like online kind of a university only providing online courses. And so Shanhe means Shan in the Shandong province, and Shanxi province, He means Henan province, and Hebei province. So these are the 4 provinces traditionally had produced very high achievers in the Gaokao. And yet, among these regions, they only got 2 elite universities and 3 second-tier universities. So historically, these regions, there's anyone from Shandong? No? Shanxi, no. So they always kind of had a huge disadvantage in terms of accessing the best opportunities in universities. So in late 1990s, a group of parents from Shandong took the government, central government, to court because of this kind of geographical inequality in allocation of higher education opportunities. So now we look at a bigger picture. It's very similar to what Emily, mentioned earlier about this kind of geographical inequality in allocations of educational resources, infrastructures. If we look at map of the higher education institutions, and particularly this elite university, the majority of elite universities concentrated on the eastern region, and particularly in Beijing and Shanghai. And, the central region, Sichuan only, western region, we had Xi'an and Sichuan, Xi'an city and Sichuan province had a few elite universities, but majority of the provinces in China did not have this kind of, the best resources, infrastructures of higher education. Then how does it affect the kind of social inequality in China? But the problem is the bigger question is related to Charlotte research actually about hukou. Why we don't change? Why the government didn't refuse to change this like hukou? If hukou is bad, why can't we change it? If this kind of geographical inequality in allocation also means individual province or city like Beijing, Shanghai, they have control over the quota and the cutoff points. This is kind of getting more technical terms. One is called cutoff points, 分数线. This second is called quota. So they sign their quotas to favor their own students. And they, for instance, in Beida, for instance, if for just give an example, if they have 100 quota, right, Peking University on the undergraduate level, they will give 50% to the children from Beijing and another 50 across the rest of China. So you can see the competition from the rest of China getting to Peking University much, much higher than rest the China. So this is kind of, but we need to ask the question is, if Gaokao is meritocratic, why do we have this, quota? Just because you're from London, you're entitled to King's College in London. I'm from Aberdeen, why I'm not? So the problem is, the bigger question we fail to ask, we haven't done sufficient research, is the urban elites and their resistance to changing the quota, to changing inequality. So a lot of political scientists talk about the, urban elites, China's middle class, who benefit from China's economic reform, benefit from property bubbles, and they also main beneficiaries of education and healthcare, provision. They are also the main supporters of the Chinese government, and then they resisted consistently to change any kind of resource allocations, hukou related, and access to benefits and entitlements.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you for lead us into a deeper discussion about the background, the class, and how the historically different people in different places are benefit from the social welfare provision. Let's come back to Emily. Thank you so much for letting me interrupt you earlier to introduce my colleague in when you're talking about urbanization. So at the beginning, you have mentioned like historically how the poverty alleviation during the whole long time are making the education facilities better and better in China. And you also mentioned how the urbanization process made a huge change for the life of rural people. So would you like to continue your observation about more recent changes and more recent situations about the students who are from rural community and now in rural community? Thank you.
Thanks a lot, and sorry for going over time. I was thinking I didn't have enough to say. Didn't gauge it well. I think some of the comments that have come up already are very much in line with what I was thinking about. I did want to acknowledge at the beginning how important I think sort of reducing the absolute deprivation has been. But I wanted to sort of temper that a little bit, because I think that the resource gap, as has sort of come up already, not only in school, but also outside of school, in terms of sort of family resources available to devote to children are hugely different. And, some of that, or a large part of that, is about sort of economic trends that are not really within the purview of the educational system, but I think create a really challenging situation, because a purely meritocratic system in a highly unequal society is not going to yield sort of fair chances for the children in the most marginalized communities. And I think that's the issue that's being, I sort of struggled with today. I think it's easier to design a system that's fair in a more economically equal society than in an economically unequal society. And so I think that the sort of absolute deprivation story is a very good one over the long haul, but I think the relative deprivation story is a really hard one to kind of move beyond. And I guess the other kind of point that I thought was interesting that just came up in the stories about the different Gaokao takers was about how much family resources played a role in what happened after college. And I was thinking about another important difference that I think is emerging as part of the sort of relative deprivation story is just the sort of pressures on rural family structures and processes. This is something that our group with our Gansu data has been looking at a little bit. And I think part of that pressure is the left behind phenomenon that has been discussed. And part of the pressure is also when kids themselves, if they want to be upwardly mobile in rural communities, that means leaving the community in many cases. And that is putting, I think if you combine that with the sort of demographic shifts toward smaller and smaller families, the sort of social capital available to people is, in terms of family social capital, is sort of declining over time. And I think for rural children, they're in much more difficult circumstances in that regard because of the pressures of migration on family relationships. Although, I mean, obviously people maintain family relationships in different and transformed ways, but I think it's probably fair to say that rural kids are facing those pressures much more than urban kids. And, I think the depopulation in rural areas is a really, important challenge, because I think the educational system, a big response in the early 21st century, and I think, continuing to get attention in some of the most recent education policies, has been consolidation of schools because there's so few children in some villages. And in some ways, that creates an opportunity. I mean, clearly the rationale for that is that you can provide much better resources in a centralized setting, but obviously that's also putting pressures on children, and very young children, being away from families, and part of their being away is because people are migrating, but part of being away is because kids are living at schools much more. And I think that the sort of consolidation and boarding is hitting marginalized children in rural communities much more than other children as well. And, I think there is a real opportunity for some creative thinking about what schools look like, making use of technology and thinking about alternative models. But I think, so I think there could be, I think many countries are facing rural depopulation. And I think China, both because the demographic shifts have been so rapid there, and because I think there's a sort of high degree of potential capacity for doing interesting, for trying out interesting new models for rural education, could be a real leader in thinking about what can be done in this situation that's starting to happen in many parts of the world, where rural areas are just emptying out and there are very few children. The school size has to be very small. But I think that the sort of common solution that's been tried, this boarding schools, there's mixed evidence, but I think it's clear that both one can provide more resources in centralized areas, but it's straining rural children's families as well.
Okay, thank you, Emily. Thanks for your sharing. So, Charlotte, I'm coming back to you now. You have mentioned about the hukou system, and when we are talking about higher education, the geographical inequality, we also talked about the hukou system. So, but actually, recently we know there are increasingly central policies aimed at loosening the separation between rural and urban registration. And more big cities are trying to include more migrant people into their hukou system. So from your perspective, will these policies make it easier for rural students to access public education?
It's a great question. So there's been a lot of interest in this. We've seen, a range of increasingly optimistic headlines about this, actually not only from the Chinese press, also internationally. This year in particular, in July, I think it was, in Zhejiang province, they announced quite significant changes to the hukou system, in which residents will be able to apply for local hukou status where they live, rather than it being based on where their parents were from. And that covers the whole of Zhejiang, apart from, interestingly, the capital, the megacity of Hangzhou, which kind of goes back to something I was saying earlier about, the exclusion of undesirable migrants. Particularly, this is concentrated in the best resourced, most developed, best welfare provisioned cities. And this central government enabling of these megacities to continue to exclude providing services for migrants, I think, is a massive problem, because of course those megacities are where the vast majority of migrants go for the jobs and where they want to be. Zhejiang province is not the first province to remove restrictions. So we also have seen similar things in Shandong, in Jiangxi, in Hainan, 2014, 2021, and 2022. So this isn't as new as we might think. I suppose we might think that Zhejiang, intimately connected with Xi Jinping, and it's supposedly this common prosperity demonstration concentration zone, that maybe something exciting will happen there. But I think the exclusion of Hangzhou from that is really very significant. And it will be instructive, I think, to see what percentage of applicants in Zhejiang to change their hukou are actually given the urban hukou there. Experiences in other provinces that have already done this tend to suggest a strong preference, as I indicated, among local officials to favor very wealthy or highly skilled migrants. In August this year, there was also a call from the central government in China for local governments to abolish all kinds of hukou restrictions in cities that have fewer than 3 million people and to relax them in cities with populations of 3 to 5 million people. Again, it sounds very optimistic. Again, it's not as new as we might think. We had similar policy statements in 2020, in 2021, actually going back to 2016 and 2015. And of course, the really important thing, I suppose, to think about there is the pushback against this. And this goes to what you said, yeah, is that even these kind of really, I think, relatively unambitious policy goals have met a lot of resistance, local obstacles, in the individual cities, as well as more fundamental problems with China's political economy. I think one of the major issues that, not just in China, globally, wealthy residents of larger, better resourced cities are reluctant to share their relative, if not absolute prosperity with the less well-off. And of course, the timing is pretty important too now. If we look at China, as we heard in earlier presentations this week, we've got a slowing economy, we've got massive youth unemployment, some suggest of 40%, pretty horrible. We don't know because they didn't release the figures, but so what we have seen, I think, Rocky, is a pattern of tinkering around the edges with the hukou system rather than doing any really substantial reforms. Incremental change, it's going in the right direction, but I think it probably does very little to improve the experiences of the very large number of rural hukou registered people who live in tier 1 Chinese very attractive mega cities and make up the vast majority of the migrant population in China. And finally, I'm probably out of time, but I was just going to say, are we likely to see more substantial change in this that would enable these rural migrant children to get an education in these cities? I think it's unlikely. Maybe I'm just being very pessimistic, but I think a key priority for Xi, we've gone into the realm of politics, not education now, but I think a key priority for Xi at the moment is stability. He's facing all kinds of, problems on the domestic and international front. And I think a key priority is going to be maintaining that support from those urban populations, especially in the megacities. I do not see him wanting to destabilize that in any way. So I think we are very unlikely to see a centrally coordinated push for really more substantive reform of the hukou system that would enable or would force these megacities to share their resources more widely. I'm very sorry to say.
Okay. Thank you, Charlotte. Thank you for sharing us to understand more about how the hukou reform is also a kindly selective and exclusive kind of reform. Xia, recently, there has been a central policy encouraging most students to attend public rather than private schools. Could you talk more about this policy and how will these impact the situation of migrant children in China?
Thanks for the question. This is an ongoing issue, and I think its progress and effects on migrant children's education remain to be seen. Just to give you a bit historical background on this issue, if we look back to the time immediately after China's economic reform, the post-Mao leaders, they acknowledged that over-centralization has killed the initiatives of local governments. So they began to decentralize the control of education to provincial, county, and maybe town level governments. And from then, the local governments had to find money for education on their own because it's no longer provided by the central government. However, they experienced difficulties in financing education. And facing this problem, they reduced the number of schools. I think Emily mentioned this. They closed many village schools. And also, they left part of the education issue to be solved by the market. So against this background, schools run by non-state agents or minban schools started to boom since the 1990s. After 30 years, in 2021, this process of privatization of education was reversed in a certain sense. In doing this, the central government took two main measures. One is to reduce the proportion of students enrolling in private schools, as Rocky just introduced. And the other is to crack down on the private tutoring industry, as some of you may have heard of. So the top leaders in China, they believe that the private sector has contributed to educational inequality. And the two measures I just mentioned are the key efforts to solve the problem of increasing inequality in their view. And which actually aligns with President Xi's goal of common prosperity proposed also in 2021. So how will this new policy of reducing the proportion of students in private schools affect migrant children's education? I tend to be pessimistic. So many migrant children, they go to private schools because oftentimes this is their only choice. The public schools, they tend to accept local hukou children, as Charlotte has talked about. So I read some news from last year to this year, and it was reported that in Guangdong and in Guizhou, at least, many private schools that enroll a big number of migrant children have been told by local governments not to accept new students after the new policy was launched. So, and also, I think the effect of the new policy can vary from place to place. In Guangdong, for example, private schools have been playing a big part in offering education to migrant children. Although migrants there, they don't have local hukou, many of them managed to send their children to private schools. So I personally would expect the policy to have more influence in Guangdong. By contrast, for example, in Beijing, the number of private schools that formerly targeting migrant children is already very small. So I expect the influence of the new policy may be smaller there.
Okay, thank you for your very detailed data from your research and your what you can foresee. So Emily, do you have anything want to add on about based on what our other panelists already said? Or we can just open the floor to the audience now.
Opening up sounds good to me.
Okay, so now let's open the floor to audience questions. We will take 3 questions first. Is there any question from audience here? Please raise your hands.
Thank you so much for this insightful discussion. And my background is kind of I'm the Gaokao achiever, and I'm from Jiangxi province, small village. So I am kind of rural origin background. And my MA program is Education Policy and Society. So I'm interested in social class, social justice, and Chinese higher education. And I did my master's dissertation topic about how disadvantaged students succeed in elite universities. I was trying to look into, I know it's kind of a rural-urban divide and social inequality will be more and more exacerbating. It's not helpful for this minor group. Even more they suffered conspicuous disadvantages compared with their urban counterparts. My kind of now I'm moved to my PhD. I was interested in, because Charlotte, you mentioned transnational mobility. I was kind of doing build on my MA research. I'm wondering, I want to hear more about your opinion. I will use identity and Bourdieu theory as my theoretical framework. And also read some articles about like some rural origin Chinese international students studying abroad, and their kind of rural habitats changing, like they kind of tend to there's some habits kind of turn out to be an asset, because international setting there's some like the rural background actually in China will kind of like more visible, while in diverse country they kind of tend to invisible. Yeah, and also there's habits of resilience, perseverance, like kind of transforming this stereotypical image of Chinese students, you know, urban middle class, they would say wealthy or spoiled, or one child in family. Yeah, so I was trying to look into like Chinese rural origin students. Is there any like is it possible for this kind of transnational mobility, and to what extent the social social exclusion or stigmatization will impact in a transnational setting? Yeah, I'm also looking to like gender, class, and place. Thank you.
Thank you. I think there is also a question at the big hand.
I'll just stand up so you can see me. Thank you for sharing your researches and findings with us. Very interesting, very informative. And because Charlotte, you mentioned that you have done some researches on India as well. That would be very interesting for me to hear the comparisons. Thank you.
Okay, is there any more questions from here? Okay, we will take more. And next round, we will read some questions maybe from online.
Hello, thank you. There was a brief mention earlier about how gender plays into all of this. Can I ask the panelists to maybe give us their insights onto this in whichever way they would like to? Thank you.
Thank you. Shall we start with those 3 questions? Charlotte, you got 2 questions. Would you like to start first?
Yeah, why not? Thank you. Sounds fascinating project. I have no idea on the actual sociological, you know, I've never seen any kind of sociological study of this. Interestingly, I have noticed that among our own students here that we teach on our program, it is very often those with a rural background, or at least not a, you know, first-tier city elite background who seem to do very well. Whether that's because of a rural habitus, I wouldn't like to say, but you know, certainly an attitude of resilience probably is very important here. You also asked about, you know, whether there was an impact of social exclusion for these rural students. Did you mean in a transnational setting? Did you mean among hard for me to tell exactly whether you meant among you know, a broader cohort of international students, or whether you meant among other Chinese students. I have seen that among other Chinese students, that those kind of rural urban differences play out even in an international setting, not in a hostile way necessarily. It might be good-natured joking, but I have seen that. With a broader cohort of international students, no, this is not something I've ever observed. But if you find it in your PhD, then come and let me know. And if you want to come and talk about the PhD with me, I'd be very, very happy to. Question on India. Yes, thank you for that. I need no encouragement whatsoever to talk about my comparative work, so I'll try and keep it brief. But yeah, so when I first started researching, my background was in China studies, and when I first started researching India, I expected to find something very, very different, a really different picture, particularly with regard to migration, and particularly because India, of course, does not have a hukou system or any system of household registration, anything like that. And you know, I just thought that shaped educational access and all kinds of access to resources for migrants in China, and therefore when we got to India, we would not exactly find a migrant paradise, but we would find a very different set of access to resource entitlements. No, I was wrong. I was completely wrong. We find exactly the same thing, even in the absence of a hukou system. I'm trying to write something at the moment on this. I'm trying to make this argument that nobody seems to agree with me on. But what I'm trying to argue is that we don't need a hukou system to do the kind of exclusion that China has managed to do of migrants. The hukou system is a nice, handy mechanism, it enables those local urban governments to distinguish who is and isn't a migrant. You have a local hukou, no, you're a migrant, sorry, we can't provide for you. But if you don't have that mechanism, you can just use another. You can say, where's your local address proof? How long have you lived in the city? Can you prove, have you got a domicile certificate that proves you've been here 3 years, 5 years, 10 years? You don't have that? We won't provide for you. So we see a very similar position, I think, in India of large megacities guarding their resources very carefully, enabling social welfare entitlements and education less, but certainly that pattern of excluding migrants from social state resources is something we see very similarly. Education is a bit of an outlier here, actually, because India is much better in terms of educational access. It doesn't hinge on local proof of address, typically. Having said that, I still find a situation in India where many children of rural migrants are not in school in the destination cities. That might be lack of access to school because the school is nowhere near where their migrant encampment is. Maybe their parents are construction workers, live on a construction site, and there's no school. It would be an hour's walk along very dangerous roads, or it may be because there's nobody there to take them there. It's maybe because there's no childcare opportunities, that the children have to go to work with the parents. It may be because the family is impoverished and needs to rely on the labor income from those children as well. So surprisingly similar outcomes, not all the same circumstances. But the one thing that really stood out to me was that the hukou is not key in structuring it, those opportunities. It can be used to structure the opportunities, but it doesn't determine them.
Okay, thank you for the gender factors, how it include the inequality. Emily, would you like to answer this question? Because I remember you have a lot of long-term studies looks on how consolidation policy, school consolidation policy impact the girls in rurals have we could say lower trajectory of their education life, or they have less access to school after the policy. Would you like to say something about the gender factor?
Sure. I think in the sort of long, the longer term picture, I think China is seeing a similar gender trajectory in education that other countries see, of a kind of gender turnaround from favoring boys to favoring girls at many levels of, sorry, not at many, but there's been a declining, let me just rephrase that. There has been a declining traditional gender gap at many levels, and in some, some research suggests an advantage for girls at some transitions. I think what's happening in terms of resource disadvantage, is more complicated. I do think we still see some of the traditional girls' disadvantage in situations like poor rural families experiencing a school consolidation. Maybe school becomes more expensive, or maybe it's further away and people are concerned about safety of girls a little more. So, I mean, I do think some of those older factors are still in play in some very resource deprived areas, but I think there's been a really interesting shift over time, and I feel a little leery to sort of make a statement about what's happening now, because a lot of the data that I've sort of looked at and worked with is a little bit older right now, and I haven't been able to do field work very recently. I think if I could just quickly mention a couple things about some of the other questions, just 1 minute.
Yeah, of course. Now we have plenty of time. Please feel free to say anything you want to say.
Oh, thanks a lot. I was really interested in this idea about the sort of advantages that rural children may bring as they move through the educational system associated with the rural background. And I think I wanted to just suggest a few authors that might be interesting to look at. We had a kind of roundtable at UPenn last year, and one of the people that participated, this was a roundtable on children in education. And one professor who was visiting Rutgers University from Beijing Normal University at the time was Liang Du, and he was extremely sort of well-versed and talked in really interesting ways about this literature, about a literature that is not sort of operating from kind of a deficit perspective in terms of the capital that rural kids bring with them as they go through the system. And so it might, I think he was discussing this sort of, pros and cons of these different perspectives in a really interesting way. And he'd be somebody that I think might have some really good ideas about where to find this literature. Two other scholars that I'm aware of who are doing big projects on first-gen college students in China are Daniel Xiaoliang Li, who is at my favorite collaborating institution, Northwest Normal University, and then Ailei Xie, who also has I think, a very large-scale project on this topic now. And then the final sort of, I think that the connection to the international students' experiences is really interesting. And I haven't seen a lot sort of specifically about rural youth and international, and how that background shapes what's happening as people become international students. But I wanted to just mention Yingyi Ma's book on international students from China in the United States is a very, I think, really interesting one to read, and she talks about students from a lot of different backgrounds in China, and I think it would be worth looking at. Her book's called Ambitious and Anxious. And then I guess one last note is there was a question in the chat about how to theorize rural education, and I wanted to suggest one name for that, which is Philip Roberts at University of Canberra, who's done a lot of work on Australian rural education and theorizing things beyond simply class that might shape the kind of engagement of rural kids with the school system. And he's also done a little work in China now. So I think he'd have kind of an interesting comparative perspective. So thank you.
Thank you, Emily. So now, are there any more questions at present? Okay. First, the left-hand side, we're back. Okay.
Thank you very much, all of you. I have just one question about talking about inequality. What about cheating? Because I asked a lot of Chinese people about this when it comes to Gaokao, if there's any known case of cheating. And I heard, I guess this is a rumor, but for instance, they said, like, when it comes to handling the Gaokao exam itself, like packing the sheets into envelopes and things, is done by prisoners in China, so it won't leak. I have heard, once again, I guess it's a myth. And when I read about education in India, I often read there's a lot of cheating. The parents give them the answers through the windows and people climbing up the walls. And I guess that's also a myth. But yeah, I just wonder, do you know anything about cheating on Gaokao? Thank you.
Two questions here in this room, and then one.
Yeah, thank you. I'm Gao Beibei from Law China Institute. I study on Muslim women education, and I just wondering your views of plus score policy for minorities, because I come from Ningxia, and in my hometown that we with minorities, we study in the same room, and in superficial way we shared the same resource, but the some students they already have a high level of study well, and they have these scores, so they were like very advantageous to go to Beida or Peking or Tsinghua University. And in Tsinghua, I have a classmates of from Zhang, from like, how do I say, Lhasa, yeah, Tibet, and he just have scores at 400 to get to Tsinghua, but others need 600. Actually, it seems effective, but after he graduates, this lack of resource has very long-term influence of his life. So he go back to his farm and do some farming things. So I just wondering your views of this minority plus score policies. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Can we have a look of the Q&A box if there are any left? Oh, here are one. I think the first one, Emily kind of answered the first one. Yeah, shall we pick the second one? Like, could you please share some insights on vocational versus academic education in China? So these are the 3 questions for this round. Emily, would you mind to start with the one about minority group? As we know, you have a long-term data collection in Gansu province. Yeah, I think you have a lot of knowledge about this area and the things happen there.
Thanks. I'm really fascinated by this question, and I think it's a great one. I would say that my own research has kind of been more at the sort of in terms of access to basic level education, and so I don't have, sort of a really good perspective. And I also on sort of what the effects of those policies have been, but I know that there have been some. And I guess, I don't know, I mean, I haven't really seen large scale impact attempts to sort of study the impacts of those policies. I've seen sort of more it seems like there is a lot of press attention to that concern. And then I've seen a few sort of studies that were, grounded in a particular place that were about this issue. But I think it's really hard to say what the impact of those policies are without a sort of large scale assessment, which I guess I shouldn't say that it doesn't exist. I should just say that I haven't seen it. I don't know if others have seen such an assessment.
Okay, thank you. So do you also want to say something about other questions? Like the first one is about cheating in higher education, or the last one about vocational and academic education path. Do you want to say something, or it's okay for now?
Yeah, I guess just a quick thing on I think the vocational education question is a really interesting one too. I did some work, not myself on this, but sort of a review paper, and there just seemed to be a lot of very, I would say, sort of negative papers documenting kind of fairly negative experiences of students in rural education. At the same time, there's, I think, a huge amount of kind of policy energy around improving vocational education and seeing that as a mechanism for upward mobility. So I feel like there's sort of I guess the literature that I've seen is sort of very bimodal, sort of very sort of spans the range of sort of, I would say, sort of very, very negative about some aspects of students' experiences, how they're treated, and quality. And then on the other hand, sort of a lot of push toward trying to a sort of policy interest in vocational education as a kind of solution to some equity problem. So I think I don't know. I think I don't think it's a sort of settled matter yet what the impact is. I think it's a good topic for research.
Okay, thank you, Emily. I think you must got something to say about India's cheating things, right, Charlotte, and the vocational education, right?
I know very little about the cheating question. I know it happens, and I've seen these press stories, and I've seen some lovely photos of exactly as you said, people climbing up buildings to pass in test papers. But I don't know, and so I would not like to hazard a guess as to what extent that influences it. I imagine it's actually fairly difficult to cheat. That would really fundamentally undermine even the basics of the meritocratic gaokao. So I imagine, to some extent it's very difficult to cheat, but I wouldn't like to comment. The vocational education question is a great question. A lot of interesting work on vocational education has been done by Terry Warrenoff, of course, a bit by Minhua Ling. I think Emily is absolutely right to say that it's very stigmatized, and that there is a literature on vocational education in China as being for the ones who failed, didn't get enough score, didn't, achieve enough to go onto an academic pathway. But my main knowledge of this comes from the migration context, and that's, a really very specific policy design for certain Chinese cities that essentially funnels migrant children into vocational education with an aim at providing a labor force in areas where they feel like a lower skilled labor or more vocational labor force is needed. And that's regardless of score, that's migrant students who may be very high academic achievers and nonetheless funneled into that vocational education because they're denied access to the academic education pathway, which I find very problematic. The students that I've spoken to who did that, the rural students, were often assigned vocational courses on topics that had nothing to do with their interest, career plan, intentions, or ability, and often ended up basically killing time for a number of years in that vocational pathway. Maybe Xiaxia, you must also have some knowledge on this. You want to comment on that?
I didn't do any interviews on this, but I think the materials I read are largely overlap with yours. So yeah. Sorry.
Or I know we are both the ones who have already attended Gaokao. How do you think about the cheating rumors? Is that the thing around your age or your experience? Because for me, I think when I was getting to Gaokao, it's not a common thing to hear that. Maybe there are some rumors, but I think once you have been into that exam classroom, you know how strict it is. I don't know who would pay a lot of money and with the risk of getting to jail to help someone to cheating that exam. If he got that courage and money, why not just go study abroad? I think it costs the same, right? How is the things in your?
I agree with you.
Yeah. Okay.
I've got many questions that I would like to ask, but I wanted to wait until I'd seen the film, that I'd been to the talk yesterday, and after the talk today. So I have two questions now. So both of them about the rural education for the rural students. I was really surprised to find out that there are now more left behind children in rural China than there were before 2008 financial crisis. So, when all the factories closed in Guangdong and the south coast of China, that there are now more left behind children in China. And I was also surprised hearing today that, because when I first heard about the Chinese policy to stop private education, private tuition, I actually applauded it, because the way that they broadcast it was that it was to stop English schools and English tutors making loads of money, charging, extortionate fees to these poor, Chinese students and their parents who couldn't really afford to pay these fees just to learn English to advance. So I was really surprised to hear today that, in fact, that policy is affecting more the rural students, the left behind students in rural China. Didn't the government think about that? And wouldn't they have had policies to mitigate, the impact on the rural students? And so that's the first question. Okay, the second question is about mother tongue, learning in the mother tongue. I've watched a couple of films recently, including the one yesterday. And I'm surprised to see how many different dialects that are spoken in China. I thought it was just Hong Kong, Guangdonghua, and China, Putonghua, and that was it. But having watched these two films, I've just realized that everywhere you go in China, they have their own mother tongue. And in Hong Kong, we're very adamant that we want to be educated, we want to learn using our mother tongue, you know, even though the government's trying to like bring in policies or whatever. So, and for rural children in isolated communities, okay, who don't have the help of their parents, it's very important to be educated in the mother tongue. And so one of you mentioned that, you know, with the schools closing down, that's the problem, you know, with the schools closing down in the rural area, there's no possibility of, you know, providing that education, never mind in mother tongue, but providing any education to the left behind children, village children. Somebody mentioned about looking at innovative ways of educating these children, getting around this, but they didn't mention it, such as what innovative ways are there? So those are the two questions that, you know, the mother tongue, and also about this, you know, does it also include charity schools, you know, banning private schools? Does it include charity schools? And so if they're closing down all the schools, what's the solution? You know, rural children need to be educated using their mother tongue because they don't want to lose, you know, that's important for their identity and important for communicating with the older generation. So those are the two questions. I'm sorry it was so long, but I've got so many more. But...
Thank you. Thank you for sharing your thoughts and your questions. Shall we take one more questions in this room? Okay.
Yes, hi. Thank you for a fascinating research and share. And I remember, and she's not here now, but I remember she mentioned that there are like elite groups who benefit from the household registration system, but resist. So I'm just wondering, in which way do they resist the household registration system? Through privatization and marketing system, process, or through something like civil society? I know civil society is a little bit ambiguous concept when we talk about China, but I just give an example. And if so, because I think some people say, like Budea, he said, education is just a process of reproduction. But in my opinion, education is actually a relatively creative social practice, in my opinion. So do you think the interview of the elite group can slow down or accelerate the educational inequality process? Yes, that's my question.
Okay, thank you. Emily, would you like to start with the one about leaving behind children, and after the closing down of the schools, how are the rural students are educated? What happened to them? And it would be better if you have any field work experience about the mother tongue involved in their pedagogic things. Thank you.
Thanks a lot. I think in terms of the shutting down of schools, I think the idea of that closure sort of initiative was that that the schools would consolidate. So instead of there being very, very tiny village schools, there would be larger schools in more centralized areas, and that kids would come to those places. So so the rationale, I think, was that those schools would have better quality, but you know, often that meant that kids have to board at the school. So I mean, I think, as I mentioned, I think there's sort of mixed evidence about the impact. I mean, in some of the work that that colleagues and I have done, we found some negative implications. If we have a study that was focused on areas with large minority populations in China and found some decrements to educational attainment associated with living in villages that had school closures. I think interestingly, I mean, to me, very interesting was that the issue of sort of providing culturally oriented education through language, for example, I think becomes much harder if in the context of kind of this consolidation initiative. If you have children from different groups kind of coming into consolidated schools that are serving much, you know, kids from more linguistic backgrounds, for example. And so I think these sort of intersect, but not not completely. I have had people sort of argue back about the if you look at the sort of negative impact that we found on educational attainment in these areas, that, well, what's the alternative if parents have moved out and if these rural village schools have 5 kids in them or something like that. So I think that's a critique. I don't know. I mean, I think it's a difficult problem. I think that our data are from sort of the earlier part of the consolidation movement. And I've heard that, some of the consolidated schools are up, the sort of circumstances of those schools and how parents view them have changed from other scholars doing fieldwork more recently. But I think I also think that there's been some move toward having incomplete primary schools to kind of serve really younger kids in communities, but I haven't seen a sort of assessment of sort of how much that's making a difference. I mean, how much that's happening and how much it's making a difference in terms of rural children's access. And I do think that the issue of mother tongue education has become much more politicized recently, and so I think that also creates, I guess there are 2 issues. There's sort of the dialects issue and then the officially recognized minority languages. And I think the latter has become very politicized in recent years, and I think perhaps less part of the plan than in the past.
Thank you, Emily.
Sorry. Innovative solutions. Yeah, I think Emily said that that we needed innovative solutions. So now it's on you to tell us what they would be.
Oh, yeah, that's the hard part. I guess, I mean, I have been just thinking about the possibilities of these, the fact that there is a possibility of sort of much smaller schools not operating, connecting technologically to each other or to schools in wealthier areas. And I know China has done some experimentation with that. I'm aware from talking to Philip Roberts that there are some interesting initiatives like that in rural Australia. I don't know whether they're viewed as sort of working well or not, but they are definitely, I mean, I just think there's a way to not think of a school as sort of, there could be different ways to conceptualize what's happening in very small, when there are very small numbers of kids, and rather than providing a full school infrastructure, it might be possible to have kids kind of connected through technology to more fully resourced schools. I think it's an open question. Is that better or worse than kids going to board at better resource schools? I think, I think it would be, I think, some creative thinking about what, how to help kids begin to learn, make the beginning of school transition in very remote communities, thinking about the pros and cons of, obviously, there have been a lot of problems that we all know from doing online school, that's not a great, it's not something that works well for a lot of kids. But I think thinking about what a school could look like with some adults, with teachers, but perhaps as part of a broader network of schools would be one idea. But again, I think there needs to be some research in that direction. I don't think it's very clear whether that would be better or worse than sort of what's being tried now. But I think there's a possibility that it could be better.
Okay, thank you, Emily. So coming back to the more broad discussion about the elite social class in the urban areas and how they resist these. Xiaxia, could you, the urban elites one, or you want to talk more about? Okay, you want to
I can speak about that question from the migrants' perspective, because once I interviewed a girl who migrated from Beijing to her hukou origin. So what happened is that indeed I agree that the dialects is about an identity issue, but I think the form may vary, because in my case the girl was born in Beijing, but because she does not have local hukou, she has to go back to her hukou origin, and she's not familiar with the place at all. So because of that reason, she has a hard time getting along with her classmates and her teachers who just all speak their dialects. So that's just one perspective from.
Yeah.
Do you want to have a final talk?
Yeah, a couple of things. On the elite, you resisting the hukou? That I think that was really a question for Ye, who's had to go to give a lecture, unfortunately. But you know, to my mind, that's a tiny drop in the water compared to the large number of dwellers in the China's big megacities who are keen to preserve what they have, you know, and make sure that they take the primary claim on their local urban resources. So I wouldn't expect, you know, we may see some activism. We have seen some activism around this, but I think it's a tiny number. I don't know. We would have to leave that for I actually wanted to say something about the shadow education ban. I think it's a fascinating topic, and I was anticipating a question on it potentially. Not different from the rural schools consolidation. This is the banning of extracurricular tutoring, which also has an impact on rural students and on other students. Yeah, I also was quite excited about this to start with, and I thought, well, that'll be interesting. You know, you shut down all these extra opportunities for the rich and wealthy. What does that do? Is it going to equalize things? A couple of anecdotes, so no major scientific data on this yet, but from talking to families in China on their experiences of this, it seems to me, perhaps unsurprisingly, that it is the more educated and wealthier elites who are getting around the ban better. You know, they're calling in favors for people to come in and do all kinds of interesting extracurricular tutoring that kind of goes under the radar of the ban. I was also very interested to find that actually in very wealthy families, a couple of examples of mothers giving up work in order to provide that extracurricular education for their children. So if you do not need the mother's income to survive, and you think that, you know, promoting the educational chances of your children is so important that you have the opportunity to give for the mother to stay home if she's educated enough herself to provide that tutoring for the child. I have now seen 2 cases of this, or clearly a tiny anecdotal sample, but would be very interesting to see if this is happening more broadly. And then I suppose not just the equality implications, but also the gender implications of this, of women coming out of the workforce to provide tutoring for their children because of the ban. So my sense is now maybe not so positive, and, you know, maybe actually this is going to exacerbate inequalities.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you so much for being here. And thank you all of our panelists. And gratitude to our volunteers make the whole things come true. Thank you, and see you next panel. We have another very great panel about minority education in Bush House. Hope everyone could also join us there and to enjoy the discussion.
And thank you, Rocky, for chairing.
Thanks so much. We really appreciate it.